Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for that introduction to the organisers for inviting me. So I'm going to talk about the environment and the developing brain. I'm a psychiatrist, so I'm going to take the perspective of psychiatric disorders, and a particular one, schizophrenia, as an example of a psychotic disorder. And I know there's a range of backgrounds and experience of what the environment might be, so I'm taking a macro sort of population level perspective. And I think the message I want to give you is that the environment is a many-headed beast, actually. We need, there's quite a lot of nuance in thinking about what the relevant environment might be for psychiatric disorders. I missed the first keynote yesterday. I was tied up with the media. And so we may have got an answer to this question as to why do we have a brain? Any thoughts? Seems a fairly important question. I've only got half an hour, so why do we have a brain? Well, if you plug that into answers, you get an answer, so we can think and do stuff. But I'm sure it's more involved than that. And fundamentally, you get a range of answers in a discussion of this. But fundamentally, it's so that we can interact with the environment. I mean, some people will say it's so we can move. A more higher level idea is that so we can predict the environment, so we can interact with the environment. So it's no surprise that it's important for the environment's important. So I'm going to just quickly sketch out what these several relevant environments might be. So there's a prediction function. There's an external physical environment, the sort of bang on the head environment. There's a micro environment around the synapse, around the brain. But of course, our brains, they also create our environment. So perception is, we are creating the environment that we're all experiencing here. And of course, the relevance to psychiatry is that our brains also create the meaning of that environment. And that's extremely important for the genesis of psychiatric disorder. So I need to be able to work out whether you are laughing with me or whether you're laughing at me. And that's a big difference. So the pendulum has swung a bit over the 20th century and into the 21st as the importance of genes and the environment in schizophrenia. This is a quote that sums up the state of play around about 2000, when the pendulum has swung strongly to genes, and the importance of the environment had shrunk a little bit. Well, that pendulum's definitely swinging back. Here's the front page of a paper from a large European-funded study of genes and the environment in psychotic disorders and schizophrenia, the EUGI. This was a population-based study, 17 settings, 6 countries in Europe and also Brazil, and quite a large number of cases, over 1,000 cases of schizophrenia, and also a control collection. And one simple way of thinking about the environment is just, well, does the incidence, the amount of new schizophrenia vary by place? So here we've got a figure that's really the work of Craig Morgan, James Kirkbride, and Hannah Jongsma. And each one of these little groups of dots is a different centre in this multi-centre study, mainly around Europe. And at the bottom here, we've got the incidence, the amount of new cases of schizophrenia per 100,000 people per year. And in these groups of 3, we've got the one estimate is sort of a crude estimate, the easy estimate. And then those estimates are adjusted statistically for social deprivation and the proportion of migrants in the population. And you can see that that adjustment doesn't make very much of a difference for many of these sites, but there's a little bit of variation in the incidence in these different sites around Europe until you get to these 4. And these are 2 areas of Paris and Amsterdam and southeast London, where you can see that the incidence of all new psychotic disorders is massively raised, pointing towards the environment. And when we make that statistical adjustment for social deprivation and the amount of migrants in the population, you adjust that incidence. So this suggests that these environmental factors are having an important influence on incidence. And this sort of urban effect, so these 4 centres are the most highly urban in this study, and we think that that's attributable, as I say, to economic deprivation, migration, sort of social disconnection, population density, and drug use. And these exert most of their force during childhood and adolescence. And this study is, again, in the news today on the BBC website, a paper by Marta De Forti and colleagues where they've got under the skin of the cannabis contribution and showing that perhaps up to 1 in 5 of new cases of schizophrenia in these highly urban centres might be attributable to high-potency cannabis. So an example of a complex of environmental factors that are influencing the amount of new psychotic disorders in these centres. So let's put this in a developmental context. I've said that these factors may exert most of their force early in life. Well, what is the relationship between development and the onset of a disorder like schizophrenia? Well, the key epoch for incidence is in the post-pubertal period. So this epoch of brain development that begins around andronarchy and stretches through the teens and into the 20s. And if you look at the age at onset of new schizophrenia, you get this amazing, highly replicated age incidence function. So here we've got age on the x-axis, and then we've got a separate incidence function for men and women. And this comes from the entire population of Denmark over 12 years, so studying millions and millions of person years and hundreds of thousands of new cases. And you can see this remarkable figure that incidence shoots up after puberty and then gradually drifts down into the 30s. Slight differences for men in blue and women in ochre. You'll also note that this cumulative incidence, so around about 2% of all men in Denmark develop schizophrenia, and around about 1.6% of all women develop schizophrenia at some time in their life course. So the sentence that begins many papers that schizophrenia is a genetically determined neurodevelopmental disease that affects 1% of the population, you're already getting the picture that that's wrong. Actually, it's a little more than 1%, and there's a lot of environmental factors. So if you think about Seth Grant's calendar of synaptic development, then you'd expect something very definite is happening in this period. And this is the figure that got me into trouble with the press yesterday, somehow with adulthood beginning with 30. I don't know quite how they got that from there. But so the key epoch for incidence is post-pubertal in the second and third decades of life. But it's prenatally and in infancy and childhood that there's evidence for an important establishment of risk. So I'm going to give you an example of that from a figure that you don't need any statistics for, and this is from a birth cohort study. So conceptually, it's a bit like the ABCD study, but wasn't designed for the study of neuroscience or psychiatry. It was a general population birth cohort study. Everyone due to be born in Finland in 1966, that's about 12,000 births. And when they were age 1, they had a developmental assessment and were asked whether the mothers were asked whether the baby could, or the toddler, could stand unsupported, holding a hand, so could toddle, basically. And then the amount of schizophrenia later in life was correlated with that early developmental motor milestone. So here you can see what we found. This is age, again, on this axis. It starts at 14, because you already know there's no schizophrenia begins in this period. And here's the amount of schizophrenia that arises in these 4 developmental groups. So here's a precocious group these are boys, by the way, it's the same in girls. Here's a precocious group who could stand unsupported at 9 months or 10 months, 11 months, 12 months. And as I say, you can see that the amount of schizophrenia that will arise decades later is higher in the group who were passing this motor milestone latest, and there's a kind of dose-response relationship. And we can't explain that away through socio-demographic differences. Finland's a very homogeneous sort of country. So there's some early signal about early motor development and risk of this neuropsychiatric syndrome later in life. Another childhood risk factor that's well replicated, like that motor finding, has been found in lots of different cohorts now. Another association is to do with childhood and adolescent IQ, and the fact that the IQs of children and adolescents who as adults will develop schizophrenia is a little bit lower. And here's a summary slide from 5 cohort studies. This good design for studying this, like the ABCD study, is showing this sort of linear relationship between IQ on the x-axis, so in childhood or adolescence, and the odds or risk of developing schizophrenia later in life. And you can see that it's higher in lower IQ children and gradually decreases over the normal distribution of IQ. Something funny may happen at the upper end, but that's rather statistically imprecise. So there's a lot of action in early development that's to do with risk of developing this syndrome in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th decade of life. So what might be going on? Another old chestnut, environmental chestnut in schizophrenia epidemiology is the association with early life infection. And really, I'm just going to tell you that there is an association. And because there's not much time, I'm going to be using these forest plots of systematic reviews and meta-analyses quite a lot, where each one of these rows is a different study, and you've got an estimate here, and if it's to the right of the line, there is an association. If it's to the left of the line, there's no association. And here's a meta-analysis of a few years ago looking at all infections, bacterial infections or viral infections during childhood, and you can see there is an increased risk of later schizophrenia following these environmental exposures. So how might they link up with, say, the IQ association? Well, here's an analysis done by Golem Kandikar, Nils Kappelman, Ken Kendler, Christina Dahlman in a large Swedish cohort published last year. Sweden has conscription, so all the men have their IQs measured around about 17 or 18. Here's a figure showing the IQ of men who will later develop schizophrenia in their 20s, IQ measured at 17 or 18. Here's intelligence. This bold line is roughly the bell-shaped curve of IQ at 18. And you can see that people who are going to develop schizophrenia or another definition of schizophrenia-like disorders, there's a sort of left shift of their entire population. So this is just showing you what I've already shown. Here's the summary slide I've shown you. Here's the slide in this particular sample in Swedish conscripts. And this time it's stratified by whether the men earlier in life had an infection. And you can see that for those who had an infection in this yellow ochre, compared with those who didn't have a childhood infection, you've got an interaction between this association with IQ. So exposure to childhood infection is modifying this IQ schizophrenia risk. And this has been taken on in family and twin studies, and it looks as though that difference in IQ for people who will later develop schizophrenia in a family, so IQs in family are highly heritable, but the difference in the person who will go on to develop schizophrenia is attributable to environmental factors, non-genetic factors. So IQ may be one of those, an example of one of those. So that's one sort of environment. That's an external environment, exposure to an infection that will trigger, of course, an inflammatory response, etc. What about other types of early life environmental exposure? Well, one, of course, that springs to mind in terms of psychiatric disorder is adverse life events. Not necessarily what we might call child abuse, but generally hard-end, abusive, either emotionally, physically, or sexual child abuse. So what do we find there? Well, here's another systematic review to show that there is a pretty convincing association between adverse life events in childhood and later schizophrenia. Now, 20 years ago, I don't think in a meeting like this we'd accept a slide. It was highly unfashionable that life events, adverse childhood life events, could be associated with a neuropsychiatric disorder like schizophrenia. Well, that pendulum has swung. So here's another meta-analysis. All these are different studies, different types of studies, case control, cross-sectional studies, or the best sorts of studies for this sort of work, prospective cohort studies. Louise Arsenault's study is in there. She's a delegate here. And here's the line of no effect. And you can see there's amazing consistency, actually, that whatever study design, we seem to be showing that adverse life events in childhood increase the risk of later schizophrenia. And there's a nice scatter around that pooled mean to show this probably isn't kind of publication bias. And interestingly, it's trauma that the person recalls, can remember, rather than simply trauma that was recorded at the time. So that's some indication that it's trauma that left a mark, if you like, left a mark in memory that seems to be, if it's causal, having that etiological force. So I've told you that it's post-pubertal period, second and third decades where these syndromes arise, but it's prenatal, infancy and childhood where this risk begins to be established. And I've shown you several types of environment that seem to be relevant here. So it looks as though all forms of environment might be playing a role. And I said this has come back into the field of view for schizophrenia research. And of course, we now have explanatory mechanisms, inflammatory mechanisms, priming, dopaminergic mechanisms. Michael Bloomfield and colleagues have this nice set of findings in the flash talk and a poster about early life events being mediated through a number of dopaminergic pathways. We've got epigenetics, programming of the HPA axis, etc. So we now can think about these sorts of associations. Now, I will take no truck, particularly from geneticists, about the fact of lack of specificity of these environmental events, because I'm talking, giving schizophrenia as an example, we could rub that out and say depression. And these adverse life events, of course, are associated with depression. Well, that's no different from genetics, is it? So here's this lovely figure from the Brainstorm Consortium that some of the authors are in the room, showing genetic correlations from GWAS studies across psychiatric phenotypes. So the genes are not specific. So genetic hits for schizophrenia are also associated with virtually all other psychiatric disorders too. So it's no surprise that the same perhaps goes for the environment. So we're beginning to rethink this environment thing. It's becoming more fashionable in psychiatry. This is actually a picture of somewhere called Breckland in Norfolk. And I don't know whether you see that as a beautiful place to go and have a holiday or a terribly isolated picture that's probably full of sheep tick that's going to give you Lyme's disease. You can ponder that, but it was to my great surprise that this picture popped up on the front of the American Journal of Psychiatry. So the environment is back in fashion for psychiatry. Now, I mentioned one of the possible mediators of the environment getting through to the brain is inflammation. And we know this signal has been around for a long time, so we know that people with schizophrenia and other major psychiatric disorders, they die early. Often it's through cardiovascular disease that maybe have its own inflammatory mechanisms. I've told you about early life infection. And we know that psychotic and affective disorders, they're also pro-inflammatory states. Inflammatory markers, cytokines, are raised when people are acutely ill. But we know a bit less about the possible cause and effect of that. Here's Golem Kandikar again, did a nice analysis in another birth cohort, the Alsbach birth cohort of births in the southwest of England, where inflammatory markers, interleukin-6, was measured in childhood at age 9. And he was able to look at the distribution of IL-6 at age 9 and the risk of psychiatric disorders at age 18. So he had inflammation measured 9 years before the psychiatric disorder was manifest. And he divided this population distribution of IL-6 into thirds and simply looked at the amount of different psychiatric disorders that arose in those different thirds of age 9 IL-6 and risk of aged 18 disorder. So here are psychotic experiences or psychotic disorder, and you can see there's some sort of dose response across this distribution of IL-6 at age 9. And when he looked at depression, from what I've been saying, it should be no surprise that he found a similar effect, so a sort of transdiagnostic association with a childhood inflammatory marker with a later risk of psychiatric disorder. So why is IL-6 high? Well, it could be confounding. There could be other reasons. We've tried to exclude that through a number of ways that may involve genetics, but Mendelian randomization, this association survives. It may be to do with infection that I've already told you about, or it may be to do with life events. And in fact, I think this is the last one of these systematic review shortcuts I'll show you, but there is evidence that adverse life events in children are associated with a pro-inflammatory state later in life, either in adolescence or in adulthood. So here we've got lots of studies for different cytokines, CRP, IL-6, and TNF-alpha, all showing evidence of increased risk of raised inflammatory markers when they're measured later in life. So we've got now a mechanism for these early environmental effects. Now, I said I wanted to give you several examples of the environment. So lastly, in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to just get us thinking about environment as meaning, this thing about are you laughing at me or with me, and why would that bother me? We're all here from universities, and we all know that student mental health is a huge concern. This is on the left is a report on it from our national universities trade union, Universities UK. And in Cambridge, as in many universities, we're terribly worried about student mental health, what the university environment is doing to students. And at worst, of course, we have student suicides. But student counselling services around the UK certainly are full to the gunnels with stressed, depressed and anxious students. So some colleagues and I, led by Julieta Galante there, did an experiment as to whether mindfulness-based stress reduction. Anyone here practice mindfulness? A few people. I don't myself, but it's highly acceptable within a student body. And we wanted to know whether making mindfulness training available to students early in an academic year had an effect on their huge levels of stress during the exam term. So mindfulness is about, if you like, taking the sting out of thoughts and feelings, not trying to get them away, but altering the meaning of them. So this is, just for those of you who are interested, it's based on Peace in a Frantic World by Mark Williams, entirely secular, 8-week courses for groups of 30 students. It ran for a year, and then we did a randomized controlled trial. And we had a sort of experiment within the experiment in the exam term, whether students were randomized to mindfulness or not. They all got this massive whack of stress during the exam term. So here's mindfulness-based stress reduction trying to change the meaning of the university environment. And fantastic for our students, over 600 of them allowed themselves to be randomized to either have mindfulness training this year or next. And we had a reasonable follow-up right through to the examination term. So here's one way of looking at the results. That's not a good way of looking at the results, actually. Let's come back, good. So here are controls and those who got the mindfulness, so 300 students at baseline. Here's a distress score, depression and anxiety really, measured by something called Cohort. And you can see at baseline, these box and whisker plots are virtually identical because that's randomization, that's the experiment. But after the course, after 8 weeks, you can see the controls are beginning to creep up. The median is above this line. Mindfulness has gone down. During the exam, stress, controls are a bit higher. The mindfulness group has stayed down. Looking at it another way, I prefer this way. Here we are looking side on at the distributions of stress in our students. Firstly, before the mindfulness course, and you can see these two distributions overlap each other. So the pink are the students who didn't get the mindfulness course, the green in front are the students who did. This is randomization, they're just about the same. This is the stress score from low to high. After the intervention, you can see that the pink students who didn't get the mindfulness course are beginning to creep out a little bit to the right. And during this universal stressor of the exam term, the students who didn't get the mindfulness course are really moving out to the right. They're more stressed, whereas mindfulness seems to have kept those students in about the same position. So this is consistent with a kind of resilience effect. So something you might not have been expecting to listen to in this lecture does seem to be taking the edge off the university environment for these students and making them resilient to this developmental stress that we've all been through ourselves. So that particular course, it seemed acceptable, safe, it had a nice population effect on all the students, and is here, and give it to you as an example where you can control the environment, or at least attenuate the environment as meaning. So I hope I've told you that our brain interacts with different sorts of environment, from physical right through to meaning, and it does so of relevance to adult life course disorders early in life. We've got this long developmental phase that's relevant to mental health and mental illness. It's the post-pubertal period that's key for the emergence of these disorders. But genetic, I presume, and environmental risk is established earlier in life. And I've given you these several examples of different types of environmental developmental risk, and ending with mindfulness-based stress reduction, which a few of you are familiar with, but perhaps we should all have a go at. So thanks very much for listening.
Peter, regarding the infection aspect, is there any chance that the result is because there's the genetic susceptibility for schizophrenia also impacts upon the immune system, rendering them apparently more prone to infections when in fact it's really the genetic susceptibility? I
didn't quite at the beginning, but is it genetic susceptibility?
Yeah, because I'm postulating that the genes that control the nervous system are also controlling the immune system, and that's why they appear to have more infections. And it's not the infections that cause it; it's just really a sentinel of their underlying immune, malfunction.
Yeah, I can't exclude that. I suppose I would say that we need to be a bit wary about illusory simplification. So, genetic or environmental. If you take, well, again, another old chestnut is smoking and lung cancer. So, when the prevalence of an environmental exposure is very high, if you've got a gene-environment interaction at play, if everyone's exposed to the environmental events, then the disorder looks genetic. So in the days when everybody smoked, all men smoked in the 1940s, say, lung cancer looked as though it ran in families and was quite a genetic disorder because it exposed what you were saying, that there's a genetic contribution. If the prevalence of the environmental exposure is low, but everybody still has the genes, then it's the environmental exposure that's controlling the variance. So smoking looks more like lung cancer looks more like a smoking-related disease. So I entirely accept that there may be genetic factors at play, but it doesn't mean that the environmental factor isn't still important and exerting some causal influence.
In the mindfulness experiment, did you look at the performance of the experiment?
Yes, we did. And it's a tricky one because the study wasn't designed for this. But basically, in degree class performance, we got more firsts in the mindfulness group and more thirds. So there was a flattening of the distribution. Now, post hoc explanation, psychologists in the room will correct me, that is actually entirely consistent with the Yerkes-Dodson performance anxiety function. So I've shown you that this was a population shift. So the entire group who got mindfulness were kept on their place in the distribution. So if you imagine the Yerkes-Dodson curve, and if you like, you're shifting people to the left, you're making them less stressed. You'll bring some of them, I should do it this way, who were over the top of the curve, back onto the top, more firsts. At this end, you're shifting them down the Yerkes-Dodson curve, more thirds. So as I say, that's very much post-hockery. And that, but it is a very interesting finding. So I thought at first that the tutors in the colleges at Cambridge would be pretty upset about this. But they make a judgment that they're also dealing, and they don't know what to do with the stressed out students. And they're quite happy that their thirds will go up. But it's up to the students, really. But it's a very interesting question, an interesting secondary observation that we made in the study.
Can I ask a question? I've got a microphone. Both my questions have already been asked, so I'll ask another one about your interpretation of the exam change. So, interestingly, in Oxford, I don't know if this is still the case, but it was 25 years ago, men got a third more firsts than women, and also more thirds than women. So women were getting a lot of 2-1s and 2-2s, men were getting more firsts and thirds. And there's big analysis at the time about why this was, the causes, the mechanisms. And the conclusion was that it was about the willingness to take risks in finals exams, risking making some kind of argument which either could win you a first or go wrong and get you a third. So that made me think, I wonder what the mechanisms of mind... Well, Yerkes-Dodson is one interpretation, but another interpretation is that it changes your cognitive risk-taking, your propensity to take risks. I wonder if you know if there's any evidence of that.
Well, I don't think there's any evidence for that in this study.
No, but in the mindfulness.
But you're right that I suppose I'm not an expert in mindfulness, but it might make people, as you say, less, not more risk adverse, but less motivated to take risk.
Or more motivated to take risks if they're getting more firsts and
Maybe.
more thirds.
Yeah, I don't know.
We're doing big mindfulness trial in schools. And
yes, of course you are.
With
that's right.
Mark Williams in Oxford and
Yeah.
various other people. And we are looking at the mechanisms of it as well, including risk-taking, so we might have some data on that at some point soon. And there's lots of anecdotes, but anecdotally, the people who created MISP.B, which is the Mindfulness for Kids, the Mindfulness in Schools program, they say that it's particularly useful for on the playing fields and they talk about taking risks taking kind of sensible risks in sports. How mindfulness is good for that and increases that, so it might be something to do with risk taking.
Interesting. But thank you for mentioning the major study of mindfulness that is going on in schools. Yeah.
You mentioned the kind of pleiotropic effects of the environment, and I quite agree with you. And these are very interesting observations. And one of the great sort of, and you talked a lot about the onset age of schizophrenia. So these environmental effects are also associated with childhood disorders and autism, ADHD, intellectual disability, and so on. And I wondered if you could say something about, do you have any thoughts or understanding of what aspects of environmental effects are sort of affecting the age onset and of these different disorders, and the difference, say, between schizophrenia and autism? I don't know if you have any thought. Is it to do with the severity of the insult to the developing brain, or the timing of the insult, or what? Or maybe.
I think, again, I don't know. My working explanation, which I suppose is undermined by that brainstorm slide that I showed, is that it's to do with genetic liability. So if you've got a predominant genetic liability that's pointing you towards one disorder, then the environmental effect will tip you that way. I think it's good that you asked the question developmentally, because childhood ADHD, for instance, is quite different from adult depression, for instance. But we know that in adult schizophrenia, for instance, those children who are going to develop schizophrenia may be passing through a phase when they have what we might call autistic features, but never reach diagnostic criteria. But the other thing to say, I suppose, is that for non-clinicians, is that our diagnostic criteria they're much more ragged than DSM would have us believe. So at first onset of a psychotic disorder that may become schizophrenia, people are also extremely depressed, extremely anxious, but they happen to have psychotic experiences that tip us over into that category. So there's actually a lot, the phenotype is a lot messier than we allow ourselves to believe.